I'll write the complete story now in flowing US English based on the provided premise, targeting the 60,000, 80,000 character band with the twists, mystery box, bookend, and clean animal welfare treatment the brief requires. Nobody move. Drew Hartman's voice was almost a whisper, but every passenger in that Jeep felt it land like a shove between their shoulder blades. The lioness had come out of the tall grass without a sound, and now her forepaw sat flat on the hood, her amber eyes locked on something below the front tires. Fiona Garrett pressed her son tight against her ribs. Connor didn't breathe, and the metal under that paw began to groan. Before we go on, tell me down in the comments what part of the world you're listening from, and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss stories like this one. The morning had started like any other Tuesday at Ridgecrest Wildlife Reserve, out in the hill country, about 40 minutes west of Austin, Texas. Drew Hartman was 34 years old, tall and lean the way men get when they spend more time in a Jeep than in a chair, and he had been guiding safari tours across those 7,000 acres for 6 full years. He knew every bend of the dirt road, every waterhole, every ridge where the sun came up soft and yellow. He knew which of the two prides liked to sleep in the cool of the mesquite scrub and which one preferred the open stretch near the north fence. He had a habit of counting the giraffes before he even opened his coffee, and he could tell the two adult male lions apart by the shape of their manes at 100 yards. That morning, though, something small had been off from the moment he clocked in. Nothing you could put a finger on, just a feeling, the kind an animal person learns to trust. He noticed it first at the front gate, when he found the padlock hanging slightly crooked in the fence chain, as if someone had opened it in the dark and closed it in a hurry. He noticed it again at the north waterhole, where the mud showed fresh tire tracks that were too narrow to belong to any of the reserve's vehicles. And he noticed it a third time in the staff kitchen, when he poured his coffee and realized Marcus Bell, the head keeper, was not answering the two-way radio. Drew shook it off. He had a tour to run. The passengers arrived at 9 sharp, the way city people always do, which meant they were 15 minutes early and already restless in the parking lot. There were 5 of them today. A retired schoolteacher from San Antonio named Dolores Reeves, a bird-like woman in her late 60s who had brought a pair of binoculars and a notebook full of species she still hoped to see. A young couple from Dallas, honeymooning between weddings, whose names were Blake Cordell and Whitney Vaughn, both in matching wide-brimmed hats they had clearly bought at the gift shop the night before, and a mother and her boy, Fiona Garrett and Connor. Drew had noticed Fiona right away. She was maybe 32, small and quiet, with the kind of tired around the eyes that isn't about sleep, but about years. She wore a plain grey shirt and no rings. Her son Connor was 7, small for his age, with a mop of light brown hair and a stuffed lion in his arms, so worn out that the felt paws had gone shiny from being held. When Drew crouched down to shake the boy's hand and welcome him, Connor didn't answer. He just looked at Drew with big, serious eyes, and then he looked at his mother, and then he looked at the Jeep. And Drew got the distinct feeling that this trip meant something to that boy that a birthday morning was not supposed to mean. Fiona had thanked Drew twice for being kind. That was the other thing. She had said thank you before Drew had done anything at all. They loaded up. Drew ran through the safety briefing. Stay in your seats. Keep your hands inside the Jeep at all times. If a lion or a bison approaches the vehicle, do not stand, do not shout, do not raise your phone. He said what he always said. Dolores took notes. Blake laughed once and squeezed Whitney's knee. Fiona listened as if she were memorizing every word for a test. Connor stared at his stuffed lion and did not blink. They rolled out of the gate at 9:15. For the first hour, everything went the way a Tuesday morning was supposed to go. They saw a herd of blackbuck moving slow through the scrub. They saw a giraffe with her calf, the calf still wobbly on new legs. Dolores gasped every time. Whitney and Blake took the same photograph 40 different ways. Connor eased forward little by little, and by the time they came over the ridge above the west waterhole, he was leaning against the door frame with his mouth slightly open. Drew caught the boy's expression in the rear view and felt his own chest ease a little. Whatever weight this kid carried, the animals were lifting some of it. But Drew was still not right in his own skin. He kept glancing at the tire tracks in the sandy road ahead of them, tracks that had been made sometime after last night's rain and did not match the tread on his own tires. He kept glancing at the radio, waiting for Marcus to check in and confirm the morning feeding count. And when the radio finally crackled at 10:22, it was not Marcus's voice at all. It was Priya Nair, the veterinarian, and she sounded like a person trying very hard not to sound worried. "Drew, come back. Go for Drew. You seeing the West Pride out your way?" Drew slowed the jeep. "Just the females on the ridge." "Why?" "Do a head count on the cubs when you get a clean look." He said he would. He didn't ask why. Priya wasn't the kind of person who called for chit-chat. He rolled forward another half-mile and let the jeep coast to a stop in the shade of a live oak that grew right at the edge of the Pride's usual afternoon spot. The passengers went quiet, the way passengers always went quiet when they got their first close look at a full-grown lion asleep in the shade. There were 3 females stretched out in the grass, tails flicking. There were 2 cubs tussling near their mother's belly. And there was supposed to be a 3rd cub, a female they called Mesa because of the sand-colored patch on her shoulder. Mesa was not there. Drew keyed the radio and told Priya. Priya said the word he was already thinking: missing. Since the morning feeding, nearly 3 hours now, and Marcus was not answering his radio and had not been seen since 8 in the morning either. Drew swallowed. He put the mic back in its clip and glanced at the passengers. Dolores had lowered her binoculars. Fiona was watching him, and she had gone still in a way that Drew, who had watched a lot of tourists panic in a lot of ways over the years, recognized immediately. She was not scared for herself. She was scared she had brought her son to the wrong place on the wrong day. He forced a smile. Just a head count situation, nothing to worry about. He turned the jeep around, slow. That was when they came around the last bend of the dry creek bed, and Drew saw the lioness for the first time. She was walking straight toward them across the open flat, not stalking, not zigzagging the way lions do when they are hunting. She was walking with intent, the same way a mother walks toward a school when the office has called. Her ears were forward, her tail was low. She was one of the older females in the West Pride, the matriarch really, an 8-year-old they had named Willa, and Drew had watched her raise 4 litters and lose one to disease in the winter of the year before. Willa knew this jeep. Willa knew Drew's voice, and right now Willa was coming for them like the jeep owed her something. Drew stopped the vehicle and cut the engine. He raised both hands off the wheel, palms open, the way you do when you want an animal to see that you are not a threat. He heard Whitney make a small sound in her throat. He heard Blake say, "Oh my God," under his breath and reach for his phone. Drew, without turning around, said in a low, steady voice, "Put the phone down, please. Do not raise it. Do not stand up. Do not talk." Blake put the phone down. Willa walked up to the driver's side, and then she walked around the front, and then, without hurry and without any warning at all, she pressed one enormous forepaw flat against the hood of the Jeep. The whole vehicle rocked forward on its suspension. Her head lowered. Her eyes went past the hood and locked on something under the front axle. That was the moment Fiona Garrett squeezed her son. That was the moment Connor buried his face in her shoulder. That was the moment Drew's mouth went dry and he understood, very fast, that he was not looking at aggression. He was looking at a mother who had found what she was looking for. Willa was not staring at Drew. She was staring under his tires. Drew tilted his side mirror down, careful not to move his shoulders. He adjusted the angle a little more, and in the dusty reflection, he found her. A small, tawny shape, no bigger than a large house cat, wedged tight between the rear axle housing and the frame of the Jeep. One of her back legs was hooked between two brackets. She was alive. Her sides were moving. She was completely, terribly still. Drew's stomach dropped through the floorboards. He couldn't move the Jeep. Not forward, not back. He would drag that little leg through the metal and take it clean off, and Willa was 3 feet from his face, and she would know the second he did. He keyed the radio, so slow his fingers felt like they belonged to someone else. "Priya, come back. Go." "I found Mesa." There was a pause, just breath on the line. Then Priya said very carefully, "Where?" "Under the Jeep." Another pause. Drew could hear her thinking. "Alive. Alive. Leg caught in the frame. I can't roll off her. How close is the mother?" "On the hood." Fiona, in the back seat, made a small sound, like the air had been taken out of her. Priya's voice came back tight and fast. "We're 12 minutes out. Do not move the vehicle. Do not exit. Do not raise voices. I am pulling the wire cutters and the sedation kit. Drew, you keep her talking. Keep her calm." "Priya, I don't talk lion." "You do today." Drew set the mic down very gently. He turned his head about 1/4 of an inch to look at his passengers. Dolores had gone the color of oatmeal. Whitney was crying without making a sound. Blake was frozen with his phone in his lap, staring at Willa with the expression of a man who had suddenly remembered that he was going to be a father in 6 months and had not yet made a will. And Fiona. Fiona was looking at Drew, and her lips were moving, and Drew realized she was praying. Connor lifted his head from his mother's shoulder. He was 7 years old, and he had been quiet for 2 hours, and now he looked past his mother, past the front seat, past Drew, and he looked at Willa. And Willa looked back at him. Drew watched it happen, and he never forgot it. The lioness's amber eyes lifted off the hood for 1 full second and settled on the small boy in the back seat with the stuffed lion in his arms. Nothing changed in her body. She did not shift her paw. She did not lower her ears. She just looked at him, and Connor very slowly held up his stuffed lion, the shiny felt paws and the button eyes, and he held it toward her the way a child offers a toy to another child in a waiting room. His mother wrapped her hand around his wrist and drew it gently back down. Willa's eyes went back to the axle. Drew let out the breath he had been holding. Under his seat, behind a pair of jumper cables and a coil of nylon rope, was a long, thin fiberglass rod he used to check the tires for punctures without having to lie down in the dirt. He worked it out slow, 1 inch at a time, and he threaded it out the driver's side window at an angle so shallow that Willa didn't so much as flick an ear. He held the rod low along the running board. His hand was shaking. He set his jaw and made it stop. He keyed the radio 1 more time. "Priya, talk me through the bracket." She did. Every angle, every push, every stop. Drew followed her voice like a rope in the dark, and he never once looked away from Willa. He worked the rod under the frame. He felt for the shape of the bracket by touch. He nudged, held, breathed, nudged again. And Willa watched him. She watched him the way you watch a stranger repairing something that belongs to you, not friendly, not trusting, just watching. The rod caught. Drew felt the bracket shift 1/4 inch. And under the Jeep, Mesa cried out, just once. A short, rough, high-pitched yelp. Willa's whole body jerked once, and her head dropped toward the front of the Jeep, and for 1 moment Drew was certain, absolutely certain, that she was going to come through the windshield after him. She didn't. She lowered her muzzle almost to the hood, and she stayed there, breathing hot air through her nose in short blasts, and she waited. Drew, with a slowness that made his shoulder muscles burn, pulled the rod back 6 inches. He let it rest. He counted to 10 in his head. He tried again, 1 soft push, and this time the bracket gave, and the little cub dropped into the dry grass between the tires. She scrambled sideways on three legs, blinked twice in the bright Texas light, and ducked out from under the Jeep on the passenger side. Willa saw her. The lioness lifted her paw off the hood. The metal snapped back up with a soft pop. She stepped off the front bumper. She crossed the 10 feet to her cub in 4 unhurried strides, and she lowered her enormous head, and she pressed her muzzle into the little one's side and stayed there. Not licking, not fussing, just breathing against her. She held that pose for nearly a full minute. Nobody in the Jeep moved. Then Willa lifted her head. She looked once at the Jeep, not at Drew, not at any face in particular. She looked at the vehicle as if she were reading a sign that had confused her. And then she turned. She walked her cub, slow and easy on 3 good legs and one that dragged, into the shade corridor where the Pride was waiting. She never looked back. Drew set the fiberglass rod on the passenger seat and let out a breath that seemed to come from underneath the floorboards. His hands would not stop shaking. Behind him, Dolores had put her face in her hands. Whitney was still crying. Blake was staring at his phone as if he had forgotten what it was for, and Connor lifted his face from his mother's shoulder, watched Willa and Mesa disappear into the brush, and he said in a small, clear voice, "Was the baby scared?" Drew turned in his seat and looked at the boy. He thought about the little cub under the hot metal of the chassis. 3 hours, alone, not making a sound. He thought about how long that was. He thought about how quiet a small living thing has to make itself when it does not understand what is happening. "It probably had been for a while," Drew said. "But it isn't anymore." Connor nodded, slow, as if that answer had cost him something to receive. Fiona did not let go of her son for the rest of the drive back. Priya's team came racing around the bend, 3 minutes later in the veterinary truck, dust rolling off the tires. Priya jumped out with a rifle case in one hand and a med bag in the other, and she took one look at Drew's face and she stopped moving entirely. Did we lose her? No. She walked out on 3 legs. Willa took her home. Priya blinked. She looked at the empty stretch of grass where Willa had been standing. She looked at the hood of the Jeep, where a wide, dusty print of a lion's paw sat perfectly centered in the paint. She looked back at Drew. "Home," she repeated very quietly. "Home," Drew said. Priya climbed into the Jeep beside Drew, and she rode back with them, and she did not speak the whole way. When they pulled through the reserve gate and rolled into the staff yard, there was already a small crowd of keepers gathered near the office, and Drew knew from the way they were standing that something else had happened, something separate, something bad. Marcus Bell, the head keeper, was still not there. They found his truck an hour later, parked along the fire road on the east boundary, keys still in the ignition, driver's door hanging open. His radio was on the seat. His boot prints led away from the truck for about 40 feet and then stopped, as if he had turned around and gone somewhere else on his own 2 feet, without wanting anyone to track him. There was a coil of wire cutters in the truck bed that did not belong to the reserve. There was a fresh cut in the perimeter fence, about 100 yards from where he had parked, and the cut was about the size of a small cub. That was the first twist in what turned out to be a much longer story. The passengers stayed at the reserve that afternoon because they had to. There was paperwork, there were statements. There was the sheriff, a big, soft-spoken man named Ellis Trujillo, who had gone to high school with Drew and who now had to sit down at the picnic table under the mesquite and write everything down in a notebook while his deputy took photographs of the Jeep and the paw print and the tire tracks in the mud at the North Waterhole. Dolores and Blake and Whitney gave short, simple statements and then sat in the visitor pavilion, drinking cold water and staring at nothing. Dolores kept whispering that she had felt God in that grass. Blake told his wife 3 times that he loved her. Whitney did not stop crying until the sun was low over the ridge. Fiona and Connor stayed close together at the far end of the picnic table. Fiona had asked, very quietly, if there was somewhere Connor could rest. Priya took them to the small break room in the vet clinic, gave the boy a juice box and a folded blanket, and let him curl up on the couch. He fell asleep in less than a minute, his stuffed lion tucked under his chin. Fiona did not go back to the picnic table. She stood in the doorway of the vet clinic and she watched her son sleep. And when Drew found her there, she was crying without making a sound. "Ma'am," Drew said, "you okay?" Fiona wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and shook her head, not to say no, but to say she couldn't answer yet. Drew leaned on the doorframe and waited. He had learned, over 6 years of taking people on tours, that when a person is trying to say something hard, the fastest way to hear it is to shut up. Fiona said finally, "He picked this place." Drew tilted his head. "For his birthday, he wanted the safari. He kept asking for months. I don't know why." She let out a laugh that had no joy in it. "I don't know why I said yes. I told myself he would love it. I told myself it would be a good memory for him, something to hold on to." "Hold on to for what?" Drew said, very carefully. Fiona looked at him. She looked at him for a long time, and then she said, "For after." Drew felt his chest tighten. He didn't say anything. "He has a heart thing," Fiona said. "Congenital. He was born with it. They fixed most of it when he was 2. They can't fix the last part until he grows some more, until he weighs enough. But last month, the doctor in Houston told me it doesn't look like he's going to get big enough in time. She said it very kindly. She used a lot of soft words. I understood every one of them." Drew felt the air leave the room. Fiona wiped her eyes again. "So I brought him here for his 8th birthday because he asked, because I couldn't say no to a thing that small when there might not be so many more chances to say yes to something." Drew looked at the couch where Connor was sleeping, one small hand curled around the stuffed lion's leg. "I'm sorry," he said. It sounded stupid the moment it came out of his mouth, but Fiona nodded like it was exactly the right thing. "You saved that little cub today," Fiona said. "You know what my son is going to remember for the rest of however long he has? He is going to remember that a man saved a baby lion while its mother watched. That's what he came here for. He came here for a story he could believe in." Drew did not know what to say. "Thank you," Fiona said. "Twice. Once for the cub, once for my son." Drew nodded. He turned to leave because he did not trust his own throat right then, and he had walked halfway across the yard before he realized he was crying too. That was the second twist. Because if that had been the whole story, Drew Hartman would have gone home that night, cried some more in his own kitchen, poured himself a whiskey, and gone back to work in the morning a slightly better man. But that was not the whole story. The whole story started coming out that night when the sheriff called him. Ellis Trujillo said, "Drew, are you sitting down?" Drew was standing at his kitchen sink. He sat down at the kitchen table. "I am now. We found Marcus. Alive. Alive. Fine. He's at his sister's house in Fredericksburg. He drove there this morning right after he left the reserve. He hasn't touched his phone all day. He said he was quitting and he didn't want anyone to talk him out of it." Drew closed his eyes. "Ellis, Marcus doesn't quit. Marcus is the kind of man who works 2 days after his own funeral." "I know." "So what happened?" There was a pause. Then Ellis said, "Drew, he told me a story I need you to hear from him, not from me. Can you come out to Fredericksburg tomorrow morning?" Drew said he could. He hung up. He did not sleep. At 7 the next morning, he was on the road with a thermos of black coffee, and by 8:30 he was standing on the porch of a small, pale yellow house on a side street in Fredericksburg, and Marcus Bell was opening the door. Marcus was 62 years old, black, built like a fence post, and had run the ground crew at Ridgecrest for 11 years. He looked at Drew for a full 5 seconds, and then he stepped aside and said, "Come in." They sat at the kitchen table. Marcus's sister brought coffee, kissed her brother on the top of his head, and left them alone. "I want you to know," Marcus said, that I would never in 100 years let a cub get hurt. I know that, Drew said, but I did put that cub in that fence. Drew set his coffee down. Marcus stared at his own hands. He said, "About 3 weeks ago, Owen Prescott's people came to me." Drew felt his jaw clench. Owen Prescott owned the land east of Ridgecrest. He had been trying to buy the reserve out for the better part of 5 years, offering, then bullying, then offering again. He wanted to level the whole thing and put in a high-end hunting lodge, the kind of place where men from Dallas fly in for a weekend and pay $10,000 a head to shoot animals in an enclosed pasture. Prescott had money and lawyers, and according to rumors Drew had never entirely believed, patience for the kind of games where you do not fight your enemy directly, but instead make sure your enemy trips over his own feet. "They offered me money," Marcus said. "A lot of money. My wife's got the diabetes, and the insurance stopped covering the good insulin last year. They knew that. I don't know how they knew, but they knew." To do what? To make one incident, just one, something that would show up in the news, a cub getting loose, a tourist getting scared, something that would give Prescott's people the ammunition to go to the county and say the reserve isn't safe, isn't run properly, needs to be shut down. He's been building the case for years. He needs one clean incident to push it over the top. Drew was quiet. "They gave me a piece of that low fencing," Marcus said. "Told me to cut a section on the east boundary, wide enough that a cub could get through but not the adults, and to leave a trail of raw chicken from the West Pride spot to the cut that morning. Said the cub would follow it, get out, wander around. We'd have to close the reserve for the day. Sheriff would come out. It'd hit the paper by evening. That was all. Just a story in the paper. They said no animal would get hurt." Drew stared at him. "I did it," Marcus said. His voice had gone very small. "God help me, I did it. I laid the chicken. I cut the fence. And I sat in my truck at 7 this morning, and I watched the little Mesa cub come through that fence, and she started following the trail, and I got out to steer her back into a safe direction, because I was going to do that. I was going to make sure she stayed close, and then I heard a Jeep coming." "Whose Jeep?" "Not one of ours. Newer. Silver. Came up the fire road fast. 2 men in it. They didn't see me. I ducked behind the truck. They stopped near where the cub was, and one of them got out and grabbed her. Just grabbed her. Rough. Put her in a sack and got back in the Jeep and drove off toward the tour road." Drew felt cold. "I couldn't move for about a minute. My hands wouldn't work. Then I started my truck and I followed them, but they were too fast, and I lost them at the fork past the West Waterhole. I drove around for 2 hours looking. Then I heard on the radio that Priya was asking for a head count on the cubs, and I figured out what they were doing." "Which was?" Marcus swallowed. "They were going to put her somewhere she would look like a wild cub in the middle of a tour, under a truck maybe, behind a wheel. Somewhere the passengers would see her and freak out, and the story would be that the reserve can't keep its own animals contained during a paid public tour. Or worse, that a cub got run over. That would have been the story of the year. They wanted the story of the year." Drew's hands went slowly into fists on the tabletop. "I panicked," Marcus said. "I did the wrong thing. I drove to my truck and I threw the wire cutters in the bed and I ran. I couldn't tell you. I couldn't tell Priya. I couldn't tell the sheriff. I took the money already, Drew. Half of it. In cash. I already spent some of it. I thought if I disappeared it would just look like I quit. Where's the rest of the money?" "In an envelope in my sock drawer." "And you'll give that envelope to the sheriff?" "Yes." "And you'll tell him everything you just told me?" "Yes." Drew leaned back. He rubbed both hands over his face. "Marcus, do you have any idea what almost happened yesterday? Willa didn't attack that Jeep. Do you understand that? If she had panicked, if one of those tourists had stood up, if I had rolled the Jeep an inch too far, that little girl in the back seat with her son on his last birthday would have watched us all die, and then she would have watched her son die on top of it. Do you understand that?" Marcus was crying by now, really crying. The way old men cry, silent and slow, tears going into the folds of his own jaw. "I understand," he said. Drew stood up. He didn't hate the man. He wanted to. He couldn't. He knew Marcus's wife. He knew the price of the good insulin. He knew what it was to watch someone you love slip away by inches because you can't quite pay for the thing that would keep them. He hated Owen Prescott. He hated the two men in the silver Jeep. He hated the whole shape of a world where a man like Marcus, who had wept over a dead giraffe once because she was old and sick and had to be put down, could be turned into a lever against everything he loved. "Come to the reserve tomorrow morning," Drew said. "Bring the sheriff. Tell it all in one room." Marcus nodded. Drew drove home. He did not go straight home. He drove past the reserve fence, all the way around the east boundary, and he found the cut Marcus had made. He photographed it with his phone. He photographed the tire tracks near the cut, and this time he knew what he was looking at. Silver Jeep. New tread. Nothing that belonged at Ridgecrest. That was the third twist, because a man's confession is not the same thing as evidence, and Drew Hartman had been around long enough to know that Owen Prescott was going to say Marcus was lying, that Marcus had stolen money, that Marcus was a disgruntled employee acting alone. Prescott had lawyers. Marcus had a diabetic wife and a sock drawer. They were going to need more. Drew called Priya. He told her the whole thing. Priya went very quiet on the other end of the line, and then she said, "The paw print." "What paw print?" "On the hood. Willa's paw print. It's still there, in the dust. Whoever handled that cub, they'll have gotten her scent on their hands. She was in a sack for at least an hour. That's a lot of scent transfer. If the sheriff can find that silver Jeep, we can prove it. We can prove she was in it. They'll have cleaned it. You don't clean scent out of upholstery in one day, Drew. You just don't." Drew let out a slow breath. "Also," Priya said, "the vet team found something under the axle when we processed the Jeep last night. A piece of fabric, small, green, caught between the frame and the bracket. Same brackets that had her leg. It's from the sack. It has to be from the sack." Drew closed his eyes and thanked her. That was the fourth twist, because now they had a scent trail, and they had a piece of green cloth, and they had a confession, and they had a man in Fredericksburg willing to say all of it out loud. But they did not yet have the two men in the silver Jeep, and the silver Jeep had a head start, and Owen Prescott had already sent a very carefully worded press release to the local paper that morning, suggesting that Ridgecrest was operating recklessly and endangering paying customers, and that he, as a concerned neighbor and businessman, was going to formally petition the county to review the reserve's operating license. The article was already on the front page of the Kendall County Signal by 6 that evening. Drew read it in his kitchen with the taste of iron in his mouth. He did not sleep that night either. The next morning he was back at the reserve at 6. Priya was there. So was Ellis Trujillo. So, to Drew's genuine surprise, was Fiona Garrett. She was sitting on the bench outside the visitor pavilion in the same grey shirt from the day before, and she stood up when Drew got out of his truck. "Where's Connor?" Drew said. "With my sister, in Round Rock. I left before dawn. Drew, I need to tell you something." He led her into the pavilion. Priya joined them. Ellis Trujillo brought his notebook. Fiona looked at all three of them and she said, "My husband worked here." Drew felt the floor tilt very slightly. He worked here for 2 years, before Connor was born. He was on the ground crew. He was killed in an accident on the north fence 6 years ago this April. A wire snapped while he was repairing a section, and it caught him in the throat. His name was Wyatt Garrett. Drew went white. Wyatt Garrett. Drew had been standing 40 feet away when that wire snapped. Drew had been the first one to reach him. Drew had held Wyatt's head in his lap for the 11 minutes it took the ambulance to get down the fire road, and he had told Wyatt his wife was on her way. And he had lied about the wife being on her way because Wyatt had asked, and Wyatt had died with his hand around Drew's forearm before the ambulance ever cleared the ridge. Drew had never met the widow. He had gone to the funeral. She had been standing at the back of the church with a newborn in her arms. He had not known then that the newborn was a boy with a heart condition and that the widow's name was Fiona. "You're Wyatt's wife," Drew said. It came out barely at all. "I'm Wyatt's wife. Connor is Wyatt's son. Connor is Wyatt's son." Priya put a hand on Drew's back. He hadn't realized he was leaning forward. Fiona said, "Connor doesn't know you were there when it happened. He doesn't know your name. He doesn't know what his father did for a living exactly. He knows his dad worked with animals. He knows his dad loved lions. I told him that. I have a picture of Wyatt feeding a lion cub through a bottle. Connor has slept with that picture on his nightstand every night of his life. That's why he wanted to come here for his birthday, because his father worked with lions. Because he wanted to see the place his dad loved. Because he wanted to see a lion for real before he gets too sick to travel." Drew put his hand over his mouth. "I didn't tell you at first because I wanted him to have his day without any of that hanging over it," Fiona said. "But then that lioness came for us." She stopped. She looked at Priya. Priya nodded slowly. "You knew Wyatt," Fiona said to Priya. "I did. He worked with the West Pride." "He did. That lioness yesterday, Willa, Wyatt worked with her when she was a cub." "He did," Priya said quietly. "She was one of the first cubs he bottle-fed when he came on staff. He named her. He named her after his grandmother." Drew closed his eyes. Fiona said, "I'm not saying that Lioness knew who was in the Jeep. I don't want to make it more than it was. But I sat in that back seat with my hand over my son's mouth, and I watched her put her paw on the hood, and I felt like she was looking at us. I felt like she was telling us to stay still. I felt like she was protecting my boy the same way I was." Nobody spoke. Then Fiona said, "And Drew, if someone tried to do this to that reserve, if someone tried to use those animals, tried to hurt one of them so they could take this place away from the people who love it, from the people my husband died for, I don't care what it costs. I don't care what I have to do. You tell me how I can help you, because I am going to help you." Priya said, "You just did." Ellis Trujillo cleared his throat. He looked older than he had the day before. He said, "I need to make some calls. I need to get a warrant for a silver Jeep. I need to talk to the county about that press release Prescott put out, and I need to get Marcus Bell in a room with a lawyer before noon." He left. Fiona sat down on the pavilion bench and put her face in her hands. Drew, without thinking about it, sat down next to her and put his arm around her shoulders, the way he had put his arm around her husband 6 years earlier, and she cried on his shoulder the way people cry when they have been carrying something heavy for a very long time, and someone has finally offered to help them set it down. That was the fifth twist, because up to that moment Drew Hartman had thought of what happened on the Jeep as a story about a lucky rescue. He had thought Willa was just being a mother. But now he knew that the mother had been raised by the father of the boy in the back seat, and now he knew that the father had died on the same land they were sitting on. And now he knew that the woman crying on his shoulder was going to fight for this reserve like it was her own house, because in a way it was. The rest of that morning went very fast. Ellis Trujillo pulled the traffic camera footage from the county road that ran past the east gate of Ridgecrest. At 6:47 in the morning on the day of the incident, a silver Jeep with 2 men in it had passed the camera heading east. At 9:02, the same Jeep had come back the other way, this time with a small green sack visible in the passenger footwell. At 9:40, the Jeep had turned north onto a private road that led onto property owned by a shell company that, when the sheriff dug down 2 layers deep, was owned by Owen Prescott. By 11 that morning, Ellis had a warrant. By 1 that afternoon, Ellis had the 2 men, whose names turned out to be Terrell Warner and Dean McCabe, and both of whom worked in a consulting capacity for Prescott's real estate holdings. By 2 that afternoon, both men were sitting in separate rooms at the county sheriff's office, and by 3, Dean McCabe had rolled on Terrell Warner, who had rolled on the man who had hired them, who was a middleman named Silas Reeder, who had rolled on Owen Prescott himself. By 5 that afternoon, Prescott had a lawyer. By 6, the sheriff had the silver Jeep, and Priya's vet team had confirmed the scent transfer on the passenger seat and the green sack in the trunk. The sack was missing a small square of fabric, right where the corner had frayed. The little square Priya had pulled from the axle bracket matched exactly. By 7, the story was on the 10 o'clock news for the whole state. Not the story Owen Prescott had wanted printed, the other one, the right one. That was the 6th twist, because Drew had been prepared, based on 6 years of watching how these things went, for a long, slow legal fight in which Prescott's lawyers would eat months of Priya's savings and the reserve would be forced to make concessions just to keep the doors open. Instead, in the space of a single afternoon, the sheriff of Kendall County had built a case that Prescott could not spin his way out of, because a small piece of green cloth and a paw print in dust do not care how expensive your attorneys are. But the reserve was not out of the woods. The 7th twist came the next morning, and it came from a direction Drew had not been looking at. The county commissioners announced an emergency review of Ridgecrest's operating permits. The review was not about Prescott. The review was about whether the reserve had exposed paying customers to unreasonable risk during a public tour. The county attorney, a woman named Loretta Mays, who had gone to law school with one of Prescott's cousins and who had never quite been on the reserve side, opened the review by pointing out that a cub had been placed under a moving vehicle during a paid tour, that an adult lioness had made physical contact with the vehicle in the presence of civilians, including a minor, and that the response of the reserve staff had involved improvised tools and no formal safety protocol. She said the reserve should have had a policy for exactly this kind of scenario. She said the fact that no one had been hurt was luck, not competence. She said the permit should be suspended pending a full audit. The hearing was scheduled for the following Wednesday. If Ridgecrest lost, the gates would close, and the animals would be sent to sanctuaries in 3 different states, and the land would go on the market within the month. Priya put her head down on her office desk when she heard. Drew stood in her doorway and watched her not cry. "They can't do this," Drew said. "They can, but Prescott set it up. It was sabotage. It wasn't our fault. It was a targeted attack. That's the criminal case. This is the civil oversight case. They're not the same thing. Prescott's crime doesn't cancel the fact that a cub was under our Jeep. To the county, that's the fact that matters." "So what do we do?" Priya lifted her head. "We give them a policy they can't argue with. We build a protocol. We show them we can respond to something like this and prove it. And we get every voice we can find to speak at that hearing." The 8th twist happened 3 days later. Fiona Garrett walked into the reserve office at 9 in the morning with an accordion folder under her arm. She set it on Priya's desk. She opened it. Inside were 47 handwritten letters, 3 petitions, a stack of email printouts, and a legal pad full of names. "I've been on the phone for 3 days, she said. "I called every past employee I could find who is still alive. I called the widows of the ones who aren't. I called every school teacher who has ever brought a class to this reserve. I called the vet techs who trained under Priya. I called the volunteer beekeepers who helped with the pollinator garden. I called the couple from Dallas who were in the Jeep with us, Blake and Whitney. I called Dolores Reeves. I called every single tourist I could track down who has ever taken a Ridgecrest tour and who left a review with their real name on it. I asked them to write a letter. I told them what happened. I told them what Prescott tried to do. I told them what the county was thinking. Every single one of them said yes." Priya opened one of the letters. It was from a woman in Georgetown who had brought her 4th grade class to Ridgecrest every spring for the last 9 years. Priya read the first line, and then she read the second line, and then she put her hand over her mouth and stopped reading. "You did all this in 3 days, Drew said. "I have," Fiona said, a lot of unspent rage. She sat down. She looked at both of them. "There's more," she said. Priya waited. I called the hospital in Houston, the pediatric cardiology office, Connor's specialist there. Her name is Dr. Anita Kaur. I've known Anita for 4 years, and I asked her if she would write a letter. About what? About what a place like this does for a child like Connor. I told her about the lioness, and I told her about Wyatt. I told her that my son had spent 7 years dreaming about the animals his father worked with, and that his last birthday wish, his last real birthday wish, was to sit in a jeep on this land. And I asked Anita if she would write a letter to the county explaining, in medical terms, what that kind of experience does for a sick child, what it does for a family, whether the county understands what they are actually voting to close down. Priya was crying now, quiet and steady. She wrote the letter, Fiona said. It's the last page in the folder. Drew flipped to the back. The letter was 2 pages long. The last paragraph read, in part, that the loss of Ridgecrest would not be a loss of a business. It would be a loss of one of the few places in central Texas where a child in palliative care could have a full, real, unmediated encounter with the natural world in a way that produced measurable improvements in mood, sleep, and self-reported hope. It was signed by Dr. Anita Kaur, MD, and co-signed by 7 other pediatric physicians whom Kaur had gathered by phone in a single afternoon. Drew set the folder down. Fiona. Yes, you don't have to do all this. I do. The 9th twist arrived the day before the hearing. A woman Drew had never met walked into the visitor pavilion that afternoon. She was about 60, silver-haired, dressed in a tailored grey suit that did not belong within 30 miles of a wildlife reserve. She asked for the person in charge. Priya came out. The woman said, "My name is Margaret Prescott." Priya went very still. "I am Owen's older sister," the woman said. "I have not spoken to my brother in 11 years. I would not be here now if I did not feel that I had to be. I read what happened. I have some things I would like to say tomorrow at the hearing. I would like your permission to say them." Priya blinked. "You want to speak against your own brother?" "I want to speak the truth about my brother. What he does with the money he inherited from our father is not my problem, because I cannot control him. But what he almost did to a child in a jeep is my problem, because our father would have died all over again to know it. And also because the piece of land Owen is trying to buy borders on a piece of land that was left to me by our father, and I have already refused to sell to him 3 times, and I would very much like the county to understand what kind of man they are being asked to hand this reserve over to." Priya sat down. "Please, yes, please, come." Margaret nodded once. She started to turn. Then she stopped. "There's one more thing," she said. "My brother has been quietly acquiring land in this county for years through shell companies. I have documentation, bank records, corporate filings. My father's lawyer left me a copy of everything before he passed. I have never used any of it because I did not want to be part of what my brother does, but I will bring it tomorrow, and I will hand it to the county, and I will hand a copy to the sheriff, and I will let the chips fall." She left. Drew watched her walk to her car. He looked at Priya. Priya was staring at the ceiling, with tears running down both sides of her face into her hair. "Do you believe this?" Priya said. "No," Drew said. "I don't." The 10th twist came the morning of the hearing itself. The hearing was held in the county commissioner's chambers in the courthouse in Bourne, a small pale room with a horseshoe of desks up front and about 80 folding chairs behind. Drew had expected the room to be maybe half full. He got to the courthouse at 7:30, an hour and a half early. There was already a line. The line started at the front door and went out into the parking lot. It curved around a live oak. It kept going. Drew stopped counting at 300. Blake and Whitney were near the front, holding hands. Dolores Reeves was behind them, wearing a shirt she had ironed. There were school teachers Drew recognized. There were kids in school uniforms with signs their teachers had let them make. There were 3 of Wyatt Garrett's old co-workers from the ground crew, men Drew had not seen in 6 years, who had driven in from as far as El Paso overnight. There was Margaret Prescott, standing off to the side by herself, a leather briefcase in one hand. There was Marcus Bell, ashy-faced, standing beside his wife who was in a wheelchair. Marcus was going to speak. Marcus was going to sit in that room in front of the county and admit, on record, what he had done and why, and take the fall for his part in it. The sheriff had told him this would help him, and it would help the reserve. Marcus had said quietly that helping the reserve was the only thing that mattered. And near the back of the parking lot, standing hand in hand, Fiona Garrett and Connor Garrett. Connor was wearing a small clip-on tie. He was holding the stuffed lion under his arm. He looked pale, but he looked alert, and when Drew walked past, he grinned and gave a small wave, and Drew had to turn his face away. They filed inside. The room filled. The overflow crowd filled the hallway. A local news crew set up a camera in the corner. Loretta Mays, the county attorney, came in, saw the room, and stopped walking for 2 full seconds. She had not expected this. The commissioners took their seats. The chair, a broad old rancher named Hoyt Ballinger, who had been on the commission for 22 years, tapped his gavel and asked Loretta Mays to open. She opened. She read her prepared remarks. She was crisp. She was professional. She was correct on every technical point. She laid out the case for suspending Ridgecrest's permits pending a full audit. She sat down. Hoyt Ballinger said, "Public comment." Ellis Trujillo went first. He walked to the microphone with his notebook, and he spoke for 6 minutes without ever looking at his notes. He laid out the criminal investigation from beginning to end. He named names. He explained that the incident at Ridgecrest had not been an accident, that it had been an orchestrated sabotage attempt paid for by Owen Prescott, that the criminal cases were moving forward, and that in his professional opinion as sheriff of Kendall County, the reserve's response to the sabotage attempt had not only been appropriate, but had been the reason nobody had been hurt, animal or human. He sat down. Marcus Bell went next. He shook when he stood up. He held onto the microphone stand with both hands. He said, "My name is Marcus Bell. I worked at Ridgecrest Wildlife Reserve for 11 years, and I want to tell you the truth about what I did." And he told it. All of it, in front of his wife, in front of the news camera, in front of the sheriff, in front of the woman he had almost helped destroy. It took him 14 minutes. When he was done, he sat down and put his forehead on his own hands, and his wife rolled her chair over next to him and held his shoulder while he cried. Then Priya went. She talked about the animals. She talked about the protocol they had already written in the days since, a formal cub separation response protocol that she had run past 2 other wildlife veterinarians in the state, both of whom had asked her permission to adopt it at their own facilities. She talked about the training every guide already went through. She talked about the fact that in 6 years of tours, this was the first physical contact any adult predator had made with a tour vehicle, and that even that contact had been not aggression, but precisely the kind of behavior their training had taught guides to expect and handle. She said calmly that if the county wanted an audit, she welcomed it. She invited it. She would open every file. She would show every training log. But she asked the county to please not close a place that had done nothing wrong just because someone else had done everything wrong. She sat down. Then Drew went. He didn't remember what he said. He remembered saying Wyatt Garrett's name. He remembered saying Willa's name. He remembered saying that a lioness had done more in 5 silent minutes on the hood of a Jeep to protect the people in that Jeep than most humans would have done in the same situation. He remembered saying that this reserve was not a business. It was a promise. To the animals, to the men and women who had worked there for years, to the widow in the back of the room, and to her son. He sat down. Blake and Whitney spoke. Dolores spoke. 2 of the ground crew widows spoke. A fourth grader read a letter he had written the night before on lined paper, thanking the reserve for letting him hold his first tarantula. Dr. Anita Kaur spoke by telephone patch from Houston, and her voice, calm and steady, filled the little pale room and made half of the people in it wipe their eyes. Margaret Prescott spoke. She stood up in her grey suit, and she opened her briefcase, and she laid out in 20 minutes the shell company structure her brother had been using to acquire land in the county for the last decade. She named 10 properties. She named 3 politicians who had been quietly on his payroll. She read 3 internal memos in which her brother's own consultants had discussed strategies to force the reserve into insolvency. She closed her briefcase and sat down. The room was silent for a long time. Then Fiona Garrett walked to the microphone. She did not speak for 2 full minutes. She just stood there, one hand on Connor's shoulder, the other on the microphone stand. Connor stood beside her, holding his stuffed lion. When she spoke, her voice was very quiet, and the whole room leaned in. "My name is Fiona Garrett," she said. "This is my son Connor. He is 7 years old. His father was Wyatt Garrett, who worked on the ground crew at Ridgecrest for 2 years and who died on the north fence 6 years ago repairing that fence for the people in this room. My son has a heart condition that his doctors do not believe he will outlive. Last week, on his birthday, I took him on a safari tour at Ridgecrest because he asked me to, and because I wanted him to see the place his father loved before he lost the chance." Nobody breathed. "Last week," Fiona said, "a lioness who was bottle-fed by my dead husband put her paw on the hood of our Jeep, and she pulled a rescue out of thin air with a stranger she had never met, in front of my sick child, because that stranger is the kind of man that Reserve trains him to be. And I have thought, every single day since, about what it means. And I think it means that the animals of Ridgecrest are the last living thing my husband ever built, and that they remembered him, and that in some way I do not fully understand, they took care of his son for him last Tuesday." Connor was crying now, quietly, standing beside her. "I am asking you," Fiona said, "not to take that away." She stepped back from the microphone. She walked back to her seat, one hand still on Connor's shoulder. She sat down. Connor climbed onto her lap and buried his face in her neck and did not lift it again for the rest of the hearing. Hoyt Ballinger let the silence hold. Then he tapped his gavel once very softly and he said, "Any other public comment?" There was none. He looked at his fellow commissioners. There were 4 of them. 3 of them were already crying. The 4th was Loretta Mays's cousin's law school friend, and he was staring at his own hands. Hoyt Ballinger said, "The commission will move to closed session." They stood up and left the room. They were gone 23 minutes. When they came back, Hoyt Ballinger did not sit down. He stood at his desk and he said, "The commission finds that the Ridgecrest Wildlife Reserve has not exposed the public to unreasonable risk during any lawful operation. The commission commends the reserve staff on their conduct during the incident of last Tuesday. The commission further calls upon the district attorney of Kendall County to open an expanded investigation into the acquisition activities of Mr. Owen Prescott and pledges the full cooperation of this body. The permits of the Ridgecrest Wildlife Reserve are not suspended. This hearing is adjourned." He tapped his gavel. The room exploded. Drew found out later from Ellis Trujillo that the district attorney's expanded investigation into Owen Prescott would take almost 2 years to complete and would result in 7 separate criminal indictments and the seizure of 4 properties. He found out later that Prescott would eventually plead out to fraud, conspiracy, and animal cruelty charges, and would serve 4 years in a federal facility in West Texas, and would emerge broke, disgraced, and unable to hold a Texas real estate license again. He found out later that Marcus Bell, in exchange for his cooperation, would receive a suspended sentence, would be required to perform community service at another wildlife facility for 2 years, and would be publicly forgiven by every single person on the ground crew at Ridgecrest, and by Priya and by Drew. He would eventually be rehired quietly as a maintenance advisor, and he would spend the last 4 years of his working life fixing fences at the same reserve he had almost cost. He found out later that Terrell Warner and Dean McCabe would both do 18 months. He found out later that Margaret Prescott, in the weeks after her testimony, would establish an endowment in her father's name that would fund the reserve's veterinary program in perpetuity. He found out later that the little cub they had called Mesa would heal completely. Her leg would carry a small stiffness that made her look, when she walked, as if she were always thinking about something. She would grow up. She would have cubs of her own 3 years later. She would name one of them, if lions could name, whatever the lion word is, for the small, brave stranger who stayed still. But those were later. That afternoon, after the hearing, the crowd spilled out of the courthouse and into the parking lot in the pale, hot Texas sun, and Drew stood by the tailgate of his truck and shook hands and hugged strangers, and did not know most of the names of the people who were crying on his shoulder. Fiona and Connor came up to him last. Connor was walking on his own now, tie a little crooked, the stuffed lion still under his arm. "Mr. Hartman," Connor said. "Yes, sir." "Can I come back and see her again?" "Anytime you want, buddy, anytime you want." The 11th twist came 6 months later, in the middle of an ordinary winter afternoon, and it did not look like a twist at first, because good news usually doesn't. Fiona called Drew on his cell phone. She did not sound like herself. "Drew." "Fiona, you okay?" "There's a new option. There's a surgeon in Boston. He's doing a clinical trial. Anita called me last night. She thinks Connor might be a candidate. It's not certain. It's not free. It's not close to free. But there's a chance. There's a real chance." Drew sat down on his porch step. "How much?" "About 400,000. Some of it is covered, not most of it. There's a fund. There's fundraising. Anita is helping. I called you first because I don't know why I called you first." Drew said, "You called me first because you didn't want to hope by yourself." There was silence on the line for a moment. Then Fiona said, "Yes." He said, "Fiona, don't hang up." He called Priya. He called Margaret Prescott. He called Dolores Reeves, of all people, because Dolores had somehow ended up on the reserve's mailing list and had asked, in her last thank you note, if there was ever a way she could do something for the little boy from that day. He called Blake and Whitney, whose baby had been born 3 months earlier and who had named the boy Andrew. He called the ground crew widows. He called Anita Kaur at the hospital in Houston. By the end of that week, the reserve had launched a fund. By the end of that month, the fund had cleared $200,000 in small donations from 10 states. Margaret Prescott quietly matched everything that came in. Anita's hospital found a foundation to cover most of the remainder. Connor Garrett had his surgery in Boston in the spring of the following year. He came out of the recovery room 7 hours later, groggy and small under a mountain of white blankets, and the first thing he asked his mother, in a voice so faint she had to bend down to catch it, was whether the lion was okay. He recovered fully. The doctors were surprised and then delighted, and then careful with their words in the way doctors are when they don't want to promise you anything. But you could see in their faces that this one had gone the way they wanted it to go. The 12th twist came the summer after that. Drew, standing at the north waterhole one morning, watched a small dust plume come up the fire road, and it turned out to be Fiona's car. She parked. Connor got out. He was 9 years old now. He had grown 4 inches. He was incredibly a normal boy in normal clothes, and he was running toward Drew across the dry grass with the stuffed lion still somehow in one hand and a much larger version of it, brand new, in the other. Fiona followed at a walk. Drew met her halfway. He wanted to bring you a present, Fiona said. He said the old one is his, but he wanted you to have one too. Connor pushed the new stuffed lion into Drew's arms. Drew crouched down and took it. Thank you, buddy. Mr. Hartman. Yeah. When I grow up, I'm going to work here. Drew smiled. You want to work here? I want to be a lion doctor. Then that's what you're going to be. The 13th twist happened that same afternoon. Drew took them out on a private tour, just the three of them. Priya had joined them by the time they got to the West Waterhole. And it was there, in the late gold light of a Texas summer evening, that Willa walked out of the mesquite scrub with 3 cubs at her heels. She was older now. She moved slower. She had a small scar across her left shoulder from a fight with a rival female 2 seasons back. She had lost some of the deep brown around her muzzle. And walking behind her, sturdier than her siblings, favoring one back leg with a stiffness that made her look thoughtful, was Mesa. Full-grown, nearly the size of her mother. And behind Mesa, 3 tiny cubs of her own, tumbling and biting each other's ears. Willa stopped in the road about 40 feet from the Jeep. She looked at the Jeep. Drew turned the engine off. Nobody spoke. Then Willa did something Drew had never seen her do before, and would never see her do again. She lowered her head. Just once. A small, unmistakable nod. As if she had recognized someone she had not seen in a while and had chosen to acknowledge it, and had also chosen to move on. Then she turned and led her family into the tall grass, and Mesa followed her mother, and Mesa's cubs followed Mesa, and the whole line of them disappeared into the shadow of the ridge. Drew looked over at Connor. Connor was staring at the empty road with tears rolling down his face. He was smiling. She saw me, he said very quietly. Mom, she saw me. Fiona put her arm around her son. She kissed the top of his head. She looked over Connor at Drew, and Drew looked back at her, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing that needed to be said. The 14th twist was not a twist at all, in the usual sense. It was a small thing. It happened a few weeks later. Drew got a letter in the mail from a law firm in Austin. Inside the envelope was a copy of the deed to a small parcel of land that had once belonged to Wyatt Garrett, and that Wyatt had left in his will to his infant son, and that Fiona had held in trust for Connor for 9 years. Connor had asked his mother, on his 9th birthday, if he could give the deed to Ridgecrest. Fiona had told him it was his to give. He had given it. The parcel was 12 acres. It bordered the North Waterhole on the eastern edge. It included a small stand of live oaks that Wyatt had once told Fiona was his favorite spot on the whole reserve, because he could sit there in the shade and listen to the lions call in the evening. The reserve added it to the pride's territory. The 15th and final twist Drew did not know about until years later, when the story had already ended and started to become the kind of thing people told at bonfires and in bars. Owen Prescott, 4 years into his federal sentence, was allowed a supervised video call with his sister, Margaret. He had asked. She had, after weeks of not answering, said yes. The call lasted 11 minutes. Prescott told his sister he was going to be released in the fall. He told her he did not know what he was going to do with the rest of his life. He told her the days were long in the facility. He told her at the very end that he had read every newspaper article he could get his hands on about the Ridgecrest Reserve, and about the boy with the heart condition, and about the lioness who had put her paw on the hood of the Jeep. He told her he was sorry. Margaret did not answer for a long time. Then she said, "Owen, you do not get to be sorry to me, you get to be sorry to them. If, when you get out, you can find a way to be useful to that reserve on their terms, in silence, without expecting to be thanked, then you can begin to be sorry, not before." He hung up. He was released in October of that year. Nobody at Ridgecrest ever saw him, But 6 months after his release, an anonymous donation of $100,000 was made to the reserve's veterinary program, and Priya, opening the check with her office door closed, was able to trace it back through 3 shell layers to a non-profit in Austin that had been founded quietly by a man whose name did not appear on any of the paperwork, but whose sister sat on the board. Priya put the check in the safe. She did not tell Drew about it until years later. She said, "I don't know what to make of it." "You don't have to make anything of it," Drew said. "You just have to spend it on the animals." Priya nodded, slow. She spent it on the animals. There is a mystery box at the beginning of every story worth telling, and the mystery box in this one, the thing Drew had not understood for the longest time, was not whether the cub would live, and it was not whether the reserve would be saved, and it was not whether Owen Prescott would face consequences, and it was not even in the end whether Willa had recognized Fiona or Connor, or the ghost of Wyatt Garrett in the back seat of the Jeep. Drew came to think, in his older years, that the mystery box had been a simpler question. The question was this: whether a story that starts with a paw print in the dust on the hood of a Jeep, in a moment when everything could go wrong and does not, can turn into a life. Not just a good story, a life. For the boy in the back seat, for the widow beside him, for the guide behind the wheel, for the man in the fence line who almost sold everyone out and did not, in the end, sell them out all the way, for the woman in the grey suit who broke a decade of silence with her own brother, for the animals in the grass who had been named once by a man who could not stay and who kept somehow, in whatever way an animal keeps such things, a memory of him. The answer, Drew came to think, was yes. Connor Garrett grew up. He grew tall. He went to college in Texas. He studied veterinary science. He spent his summers at Ridgecrest as an unpaid volunteer, and then as a paid intern, and then as a junior technician on Priya's staff. Fiona moved to Bourne. She started a foundation, small at first, that helped families with sick children arrange nature-based experiences during difficult treatments. It was called the Wyatt Garrett Foundation. It never had more than 3 employees. It never needed to. It did quiet work, and it did it well. Fiona never remarried. She said once to Priya over coffee that some people get one great love in a life and some people get 2, and that she had not been unlucky about it, and that she liked her days as they were. Drew Hartman kept guiding tours at Ridgecrest for another 11 years. He never stopped noticing the small, crooked padlock at the front gate on Tuesday mornings, and every time he passed it, he thought about how a small thing off in the wrong direction can turn into a story that changes everyone in it. He retired the same year Priya retired. They handed the reserve over jointly to a small board that included Margaret Prescott and Connor Garrett and Marcus Bell's oldest daughter, who had grown up around the animals her father had loved and had chosen, in her own life, to love them right back. On the morning Drew retired, Priya walked him out to the visitor pavilion, and Fiona was there, and Connor was there, now 23 years old and taller than Drew, and there was a small ceremony that Drew had known nothing about. They gave him a framed photograph. It was a picture of the hood of the old Jeep. Priya had washed the paw print off the hood the day after the incident, years earlier, but the shape had left a faint outline in the paint that no wax had ever quite removed, and someone, at some point, had taken a picture of it. That was the picture in the frame. Just the paw, just the hood. Underneath it, in Fiona's handwriting, was a small brass plate that read, "Nobody move." And then underneath that, in slightly smaller letters, it read, "Thank you." Drew took the frame home. He hung it in his kitchen above the sink where he had first sat down to hear Ellis Trujillo tell him that Marcus had been found alive. He looked at it every morning when he made his coffee. He looked at it the way a man looks at a story he was inside of and did not, until it was over, know he was inside of. On the morning of his 80th birthday, many years after all of this, Drew Hartman drove out to Ridgecrest one more time. Priya had passed the year before. Marcus had passed the year before that. Fiona had come to both funerals, and so had Connor, who was now a licensed veterinarian in his own right and who ran the reserve's medical program with the same steady hand Priya had trained into him. Willa had lived, remarkably, to a very old age and had passed in her sleep in the mesquite scrub where she had always liked to nap, and Mesa was now herself the matriarch of the West Pride. Drew parked the jeep, not the same jeep, the same road. He got out. He walked, slow and careful the way an old man walks, to the spot where a lioness had once put her paw on a hood in the middle of a Tuesday morning. He stood there for a while. He didn't say anything. Behind him, a low rumble came from the grass. He didn't turn around. He knew what it was. He knew who it was. Mesa was old now, too. She still walked with that small stiffness in her back leg, the thoughtful stiffness, the one she had gotten from a bracket on a jeep frame when she was small enough to fit under one. She came out of the grass and walked past Drew without hurrying, the way her mother had once walked toward the same jeep, and she stopped about 6 feet from him. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them moved. Then Mesa very slowly lowered her head just once, a small, unmistakable nod, just the way her mother had done years earlier in the gold light of that summer evening. She held it for a second. Then she lifted her head and turned and walked back into the tall grass, and Drew watched her go, and he did not cry because there was nothing to be sad about. He walked back to his jeep. He got in. He drove home. The lesson of a story like this, if there has to be a lesson, is not that miracles happen, because they don't, not really, or not often. The lesson is that sometimes a small, brave stillness in the middle of a terrible moment, a foot on the brake, a hand not raised, a mother's arm around her son, a lioness's paw on a hood, is enough to turn a disaster into a doorway. And whatever walks through that doorway after, whatever quiet, fair justice, whatever long, slow healing, whatever surprising kindness from a stranger you never expected, all of that begins with the choice made by ordinary people in an ordinary morning, to be still and to be steady and to take care of the small living thing that needs them. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the people you love, or the animals you have known, or the small choices that turned out to matter more than you ever guessed, take 1 second right now and hit that like button. Drop a comment down below and tell me what part hit you the hardest. And please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story, because there is always another story. And most of them, if you look at them close enough, start the same way, with someone quiet enough to notice and brave enough to stay.